Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about self-compassion with Danielle Cormier and Dr. Kent Kowalski. Welcome both. Good to have you on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Dan. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, I'm really excited to unpack all things self-compassion. We're going to be talking about a research project that you've both been involved in. But let's start where we always do. Let's do some introductions. Danielle, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So my name is Danielle. I am finishing up my PhD at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. I am primarily interested, I guess my big sweeping interest, if I was to distill it down into my elevator pitch, would be I'm very interested in what are the psychological pieces that keeps athletes, and particularly athletes of similar talents, sticking around in sport. So what is the difference between an athlete that continues to go on to the varsity level, the professional level, maybe go on to coach afterwards over time, versus an athlete who decides to leave sport and pursue other interests? So with that, I study various or dabble in various trait states constructs in sports psych. So that's primarily self-compassion and grit in sport. And then two, I really, really love to coach and to work with athletes in a mental training capacity. So I like to apply our research. So I am a volleyball coach, and then I also do quite a bit of mental training within the province of Saskatchewan with our professional body here. So that's me.
Fantastic. You've mentioned you coach and you're fascinated in participants, competitors sticking around in sport. How long did you play? Do you still play volleyball? Have you stuck around as a participant?
I play right now on a recreational co-rec team, so it gets really ugly, really nitty-gritty on the weekends, but I just love to play. So yeah, I like being around as much as I can. I myself never went on to play varsity or collegiate level sport, those who can't do coach. So I went directly into coaching. And so that's how I stick around.
That sounds like my professional golf career, Danielle. Those who can't do coach, it was a quick shift onto coaching away from playing. You said there that even though you're playing at the recreational level, it sounds like they're pretty competitive, those games. So I'm assuming you're practicing all of the mental skills that you preach during the week when you are competing yourself.
You know what? I preach a lot of it to my teammates and catch myself many times in some negative self-talk patterns that I am working through. As you and I both know, it's easier to say than do, but it's great to have those moments.
I feel your pain. And Dr. Kent Kowalski, it's fantastic to see you. Fantastic to have you on. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, and thanks for having us. My name is Kent Kowalski. I'm a professor of sport and exercise psychology at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. My general interest is working in sort of stress, emotion, coping in sport, and that ultimately led me to the path of self-compassion as a way to help athletes deal with emotional pain, failure, evaluation, because I've always been interested in helping people, and more specifically athletes, overcome difficulties that they face. We know that sport can be absolutely beautiful and wonderful, but it can be also pose a number of challenges for people in it. And so that's a big part of my interest, and self-compassion has been one of those tools that I've focused on for quite a while now.
And Kent, are you a coach yourself?
I was a coach with our Husky men's soccer team. I was a goalkeeper coach for over 20 years, and then I was a mental performance consultant for over 20 years, working with many athletes from different sports over those years.
What got you into the mental side of the game? You were a goalkeeper coach. Was it did that interest in the mental side emerge then, or was it prior to that?
You know what? It was earlier than that. It was when I was playing. Canada used to have, it was called the Canadian Soccer League, and I had an opportunity to play in that when I was younger. And I had that opportunity maybe a little too early in my life, and I didn't necessarily have the mental skills to deal with it, and at least as effectively as I could have. And that really got me interested in psychology, sports psychology. So after my undergraduate degree in psychology, I switched over to, it was physical education at the time, and then did my PhD in kinesiology. And I've always been interested. So my interest in the area came before my coaching. My coaching uh, came during my PhD time is when I started coaching.
Were you a goalkeeper?
I was, yes.
It's the most psychological position on the pitch, right?
Yeah, it has, sometimes you get too much glory and too much blame.
Yes, yes. It's difficult to find that sort of sweet spot of responsibility
Yeah.
or good mental adjustment. Well, look, we're here today to talk about a research project you've both been involved in, self-compassion in sports. So we're going to unpack this review, but I think a great place to start is going to be actually unpacking self-compassion. Maybe we might start, as a general definition of self-compassion and what that looks like, what that might comprise of, maybe even for the general population. Then we can move on to sport. Danielle, perhaps we can come to you first. I know you're doing PhD, and this is actually a side project to your PhD. But what were the beginnings of this scoping review? How did this project start?
Well, I think the project started mostly because of Dr. Kowalski, who was on sabbatical and was wanting to refresh and reflect on the literature that had been published, I guess recently, or I guess until that point in the field. So I guess perhaps Kent is a better person to ask about this, about the why.
Kent, over to you.
Yeah, no, we've been doing self-compassion research for a number of years, and we've just seen it explode, especially in the last few years, and it seems to be exponentially rising, not just in sport, but in other areas of psychology and health. And the literature was coming at me faster than I could stay with it. And when speaking with some of our close colleagues that do work in this area, it's like we need to sort of get on top of this, and it's time to sort of do an overview of what's out there now, maybe provide some direction or ideas of where it could go in the future. And then Danielle did an awesome job of a scoping review of grit in sport a couple of years ago, and I was like, she's the right person to lead this. She has all the skills. She's a superstar PhD student. And I was like, Danielle, are you willing to jump on board? So it was last January, we said, you know what, we're committing to this. And it took a lot of work. And Danielle was a star lead and sort of the nuts and bolts of doing a scoping review. And she sort of allowed me to tag along and share ideas from time to time. But yeah, we just felt it was time to really go in and see what was going on in the literature.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when I made my way through this review, I noticed. I mean, to speak to your point about piles of research coming in, I think there was would I be right in saying there was a review back in 2019, only 4 years ago, and so subsequently there's been an explosion of research. So that's exactly why you needed to do another review. Am I right in saying that, Kent?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's 19 in that 2019 review.
Mm.
And then we had over 60 in ours, and that's just in a short period of time. So, and just knowing what's going on out there in different areas. I think Chris and Neff was saying since she introduced the concept in 2003, I think there's over 4,000 papers on it now, and it's just more and more each year in different areas.
Wow, Danielle, I've got visions of you surrounded by boxes of research papers, 60 of them in total, trying to make your way through each of them. Um, Kent has mentioned Kristen Neff, who I suppose started this research based in self-compassion and coined this term. I believe, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's a good place to start on what self-compassion actually is. I know the audience are really curious to learn more
Mhm.
there.
Yeah. So Dr. Kristen Neff, you're correct in saying she popularized uh, self-compassion in, I would say, the Western world. Self-compassion is originally a Buddhist
Okay.
philosophy, but she's the individual in 2003 that wrote the two big like conceptualization and measurement papers that are both highly, highly cited. And since then, the concept over here in the West has really taken off. Um, But to me, and how I explain self-compassion to, say, my mom or the athletes that I work with, is that self-compassion is to be aware of your suffering and then to be motivated enough to take actions in order to alleviate that suffering. Um, the way I like to kind of get down to the nitty gritty with athletes is that it's almost like you're trying to treat or talk to yourself in the same way that you would a close teammate. A lot of the times when we're moving through something that's difficult or a setback, we're quite harsh on ourselves. And we tend to say things to ourselves that are quite reactive and negative, which can actually like stymie and halt any progression or motivation to move forward. So if we were to take a step back and instead try to treat ourselves with the same amount of kindness that we often treat and give to others, then often that can create a much clearer and much more motivated path forward.
Listening to what you said there, it sounds like a bit of a two-pronged process in as much as there's an awareness piece and an action piece, a 2A process, if you like. Would that be fair to say?
That would be fair to say, and I think that's been fleshed out even further recently with a book that, again, Dr. Kristen Neff published, I want to say 2 years ago, a year and a half ago now. And the original flavor of those 2003 series of papers was more so of a take of a tender self-compassion. So self-compassion is made up of 3 components, those being mindfulness, self-kindness, common humanity. To explain those a little bit more, mindfulness means taking an open and non-judgmental approach towards your own inner experience. So not ignoring that something is happening, nor are you over-identifying or catastrophizing an experience that's going on. It's trying to take a very realistic approach to that setback, to what you're experiencing. Self-kindness, like I said, is trying to give yourself kindness when you're going through a difficult time. So again, giving yourself the same amount of warmth and understanding as you would a teammate. And then that last component, common humanity, is the recognition that suffering, setbacks, mistakes, imperfections, they're all just a part of being human. And it's an experience that connects us rather than isolates us. So with those 3 components, the flavor of those, again, those original papers took a little bit more of a tender approach. So a little bit more of that understanding and recognizing that we are suffering. And with this new book titled Fierce Self-Compassion, that's where Kristen is really fleshing out that action piece. And fierce self-compassion is about motivating yourself. It's about standing up for yourself when you feel like you are facing an injustice. It's giving yourself the self-talk, kind of like an inner coach, to say, hey, right now I'm not on a path that is aligned with my goals. Here are the actions that I need to take in order to realign myself. Now, that's not to say that that action piece wasn't within that original definition given by Neff, but she's just fleshing it out a little bit more. And I think it's really exciting to the domain of sport because I think it sticks a little bit better in the language that we speak.
That's really interesting because as you were describing the process there, and you talked about that 3-pronged process at the beginning, the mindfulness, the self kindness, and the common humanity. For me as a psychologist, a sports psychologist, I'm going, awesome, great, fantastic. But I'm thinking of our audience in sports, and they're going, yeah, but where's the action piece here? And
Right.
arguably in our language, because chest thumping athletes, and did I hear you correctly, fierce self-compassion?
Correct.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, interesting. I mean, Ken, you've obviously been involved in this area for a couple of decades now. Does that resonate with you, what I've just described, that perhaps it's gone from a philosophy with a set of tools where we go, yeah, okay, this is cool, this could be good in sport and adopted by sport to a degree, but perhaps it needed a shift or needs a shift in language somewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's been probably one of our biggest questions over the years is what is the way to frame self-compassion that's going to connect with athletes and coaches? What languages do we use? How do how do we show them the benefits of self-compassion even at the start so that they buy in? Because I think once they buy in, they'll begin to see it. But there has been a bit of a barrier at times to people embracing it for fear of, if I'm kind to myself, that I will become more passive. I won't take responsibility for what I need. I'm sort of just letting myself off the hook. And certainly the self-compassion literature, and Kristen Neff have faced that her whole career. And I think she's done an exceptional job of changing that narrative to one of, look, self-compassion is very action-oriented. It's sort of this question of us asking ourselves, what do we need in this moment right now? And sometimes that's tenderness and care, but sometimes it's very action oriented, and that's sort of this fierce fighting spirit. Kristen F. often talks about you know a mother who's going to take action to defend her kids, and that's a big part of self compassion and taking care of yourself as a person.
That's really interesting. We're going to get into the weeds of your scoping review, but you've alluded a little bit there, both of you, in terms of how this can be utilized. You've given me the framework there, if you like. Is this a classroom-based activity where you're introducing this concept to athletes? Is this principally a one-to-one thing? Is this something that you can just say, hey, try this tool, or have you got to go through the whole framework? What does this potentially look like at the coalface? Question to either of you. Yeah.
Yeah, I can speak to this. I would say that we have seen there's been a mixture of whether these have been educational modules developed or given to an entire group or one-on-one. So I think there's a little bit of research supporting both of those modalities. But what we do think that we know with a little bit of certainty, science, you can't ever say that everything is completely certain, but we do find a little bit more evidence suggesting that expecting that delivering self-compassion as a tool in a kind of one and done modality, giving one educational session and then see you later, isn't ideal when seeing differences in self-compassion in the athletes that you're working with. What we do find is that integrating self-compassion as a tool, delivering it using different modalities, whether that's more of a lecture piece, an education piece first, speaking a lot of the hesitations that athletes might have to self-compassion and recognizing those in that setting, speaking to, like Kent was mentioning there, the connections between self-compassion and increased motivation, increased responsibility, increased performance outcomes is really key. And then delivering tools to athletes so that they can actually go and use these different prongs of self-compassion. Very popularly used and studied by Dr. Amber Mosowich was a writing exercise where athletes would write to each of the three components of self-compassion in detail, write a paragraph or two, and then come back together and speak to how each of those could be used in any kind of setbacks that they were experiencing currently. So I think the evidence seems fairly firm that this does have to be something, this is a shift that takes place over time and does have to be an investment by the team, by the individual, but that's just like most skills. It's really difficult to expect you to learn something completely new and to be able to hit the ground running with it the next day.
You've mentioned one tool there within the framework. I'm sure there's a bunch of tools. I, as a professional golfer, would beat myself up endlessly. Case study of one there, here, just me. You can give me a session. I would beat myself up endlessly. What other? I can absolutely envisage myself, especially now as an older, wiser, probably more thoughtful person, sitting down and writing to mindfulness, writing to self-kindness, writing to this notion of humanity to myself, I guess. A bit of a generic question, so please excuse me, but what kind of other tools might be within the scope of this self-compassion framework? What other things might you have athletes engage in? Again, a question to either of you.
Yeah, I can give the first tack at this. I think some other popular tools or resources, even, we really like to turn people to Dr. Kristen Neff's website. She has a host of guided exercises, meditations, if you will, that leads folks through even really short exercises like a self-compassion break, which is 5 minutes in length and gives athletes a moment to consider their setback using that self-compassionate lens. And she also offers a couple shorter self-compassionate breaks that take on a little bit more or embody more of that fierce self-compassion too, so that action orientation. Um, Otherwise, we'll also do a little bit of a self-plug here. Our lab also has a website that offers tools for athletes to use within sport when it comes to self-compassion. So that is selfkinpassion.com, self-kin, K-I-N, passion.com. Great pun, honestly.
Yes, I was going to say.
So we offer a couple tools on there too. But also what we found in this review was that it's not always necessary to go headlong down the self-compassion education stream in order to see a difference in self-compassion levels in athletes. We also saw some researchers who were using self-talk as well as mindfulness interventions, and they also noticed an increase in self-compassion in the athletes that they were working with too.
When you speak to self-talk, and we might come to yourself, Kent. We've had a few episodes on the Sports Psych show where we've talked about rational emotive behavior therapy, and I'm not suggesting for 1 second that is a part of it, but it sounds like utilizing self-talk, linguistic tools, language tools to be able to rationalize what one is experiencing. Is that kind of, that could be considered part of the process, Kent, at all?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's a big part of it. I think
Okay.
one thing self-compassion does, it challenges a lot of traditional ways of thinking, and it sort of forces us sometimes to reflect on the way we were responding to those setbacks, those failures, and one of the, obviously it's not available to everybody, but if people get a chance to attend any of Kristen Neff's week-long workshops, a number of our lab members have, and go and do it. It is a challenging week. It's a lot of meditation. There's sort of parts of it are a silent retreat and a lot of very difficult self-work. And so I think a lot of it is challenging those narratives of our own experiences and finding a way that is a kinder, healthier way of relating to yourself. And I think if you can find that, that's probably the biggest power of self-compassion, because I believe that, as much as it's a tool, I think the real benefits of self-compassion come from this deep internal self-compassionate way of viewing the world. And I think it does create a different lens. Having said that, not everybody's going to get that far. And so even in subtle ways, I'd weave it into practice as a coach. Let's say a goalkeeper made a bad mistake, which happens from time to time. I'd just pull that goalkeeper aside and say, take a deep breath. This is part of a process. So that breath is kind of a mindfulness-y exercise. This is part of the process, part of common humanity. And if they're really struggling at that point, I'd say, what would, if your teammate had just done that, what would you say? And typically they just say, well, just get back out there. It's just one time. And if you keep having those messages over and over, it's funny how it really sets a different way and a different tone for a practice session that quickly cuts off that high self-critical lens, or that really getting down on yourself quickly, especially if the coach is right there to change that narrative on the go. And if you keep doing that, eventually you have a very different training environment.
As a consultant, I'm pretty passionate that language, narrative, the stories we tell ourselves really do influence our experiences in sport from a participative perspective, from a competitive perspective as well. So this really resonates with me. Of course, you've spoken about the potential for individual differences. And I think that's a neat segue onto unpacking your scoping review. I mean, I'm a sports psychologist who 17, 18 years ago, when I first started out, immediately decided that I wasn't going to be a researcher. I was going to go straight into the consultancy side of things. So the wonderful thing about the Sports Psych Show has enabled me to discuss with brilliant academics the research side of things and unpacking the research. But even for myself, when you put things in front of me like scoping review, I probably need to engage in self-compassion in that moment, in terms of not quite understanding. Intellectually, I think I probably know what a scoping review is, but let's begin at the beginning. Kent, let's come to you. What is a scoping review? You spoke to where this has come from, but what were you trying to get out of this? And then we can unpack the nitty-gritty here.
Yeah, I think we chose a scoping review because in looking at different kind of review options we had, we wanted one that allowed us to look at the breadth of different kind of designs, so ensure we included qualitative research within it. We wanted something that was as comprehensive as possible, but also allowed us some flexibility to have maybe a critical lens to it, to actually use some of our experiences in the writing of it as well. So in addition to just sort of being a summary of the literature, which I think, we've done a good job of, it does provide us some room to say, okay, here's some of the themes that we're really seeing and ideas for future directions. And we wanted an approach that allowed us to really sit back and reflect and read and do our best job as almost the instruments of the research to see what we're really finding and not get too caught up in some of the details at times, and really sit back and try and send some messages into the universe of where we thought the research was at now and where it could go.
Let's unpack it. I suppose, Danielle, over to you. I mean, what are and you could probably both riff here together. What are some of the things that you uncovered? As we mentioned earlier, a huge amount of, I think it was, as you said, 19 research papers in 2019, 60 now. You're there with your boxes of research papers. You're learning about what these research papers say about self-compassion. I mean, what kind of things did you uncover and discover?
Yeah. Well, I think I'll start big, and then perhaps we can narrow down. Just like Kent was saying, we're looking for breadth. So yeah, we uncovered or thought and found many results on many different facets of the bulk of the research. So we ended up finding 69 publications that fit within our inclusion criteria, and those inclusion criteria being they had to involve sport and sport participants in some way. So involving not necessarily athletes, but could also involve athletic trainers, coaches, etc. And then had to involve self-compassion in some way too. So we found, to give you some general characteristics of all of those publications, more than half, so I do have my numbers in front of me. It's not that I'm pulling this out of my own brain. A little over 62% of those papers were quantitative, and a little over 83% were cross-sectional, so meaning that they were taking one data point at one time rather than measuring or collecting data, collecting numbers, collecting responses from participants over long periods of time. So that was quite interesting. I think some of our recommendations was for a little bit more balance in balancing that quantitative with the qualitative. So always numbers are great, but wanting to get some lived or talk with participants, talk with athletes, talk with coaches about their lived experiences. And then two, it's incredibly important to get data that speaks to long-term experiences. And that's the best way to measure change in individuals. We also found that the vast majority, over 80% of the research, was conducted by researchers residing in westernized countries. And that the majority of our participants, there were over 10,000 participants in kind of the meta sample of our review, were collegiate athletes, so a little over 40%, and female and women athletes were sampled slightly more than their male or men participants. So that was kind of the big brush stroke. A couple of more specific themes. Researchers were very interested in themes like the differences in self-compassion levels of those that identified with different sexes and genders. So what we found with that was that 11 out of 16 studies found no significant differences in the self-compassion levels between men and women or male and female sport participants. As for competitive level, that was of interest of 9 researchers. 5 out of 9 found no significant differences between self-compassion and the level of competition of an athlete. And sport types seemed to be of interest as well too. And 3 out of 4 of those studies found, again, no significant differences between the self-compassion levels of athletes competing in different sports. So I think one was comparing football to soccer, one was comparing individual sport to team sport, etc. So those were kind of some very broad brushstrokes. And then, of course, there was a lot of interest in the relationship between self-compassion and performance, as well as self-compassion and well-being.
Yes.
And I think those are kind of the big 2 chunks. I won't speak for Kent, but I feel like he agrees with me that we were maybe most interested in. And what we found was kind of an interesting trend with the self-compassion and performance literature. And what we noticed is that when performance was measured from a retrospective and performance perception, so how the athlete felt they performed after the performance had occurred, we found that self-compassion was positively related and led to more enhanced performance outcomes. But when performance was measured from an objective lens, so let's say a sprint time, let's say a expert judge, we found no relationship between self-compassion and performance.
What do you mean by that? No relationship between self-compassion and performance, and please excuse this question. So a self-compassion intervention didn't work, or that how somebody reported in terms of their experiences of self-compassion had little impact on performance?
The latter of the two. So I don't believe it's to the best of my knowledge that of the objective measurements of performance, there was no type of intervention that went ahead beforehand.
Okay.
Researchers were just simply taking a before and after snapshot of self-compassion levels. They were just taking a snapshot of a self-compassion level of an athlete and then seeing if that indicated whether higher performance would occur or lower performance would occur. But they just simply found that those 2 variables, again, when performance was measured objectively, did not co-vary with one another.
But when it was assessed subjectively around how well an athlete felt that they had performed, then
Correct.
there was a positive relationship between self-compassion and that perception.
That's correct. So there seems to be a difference in how an athlete assesses their own performance and their self-compassion levels versus how a third party or a stopwatch measures that performance and an athlete's self-compassion levels.
Question to either of you then: how are you unpacking that? Is there any interpretation on that? Does that mean anything to you, or is that just it was what it was?
I think what Kent and I have talked about is perhaps, and we are just speculating here, we have nothing really to back us up.
Of course.
But perhaps there's something to do with that self-compassion can get an athlete closer to their personal best rather than to the top of the podium, the top of the pile. I think as individuals, we all kind of have that bandwidth, that threshold of what we are capable of. So perhaps self-compassion is something that can push us to be the very best that we can be, but of course does not control or help put us apart from people that are perhaps using other mental skills that are self-compassionate themselves. So maybe, just maybe, self-compassion can help us push to our personal best, and that's why individuals who rate themselves high in self-compassion also tend to experience more perceptions of better performance.
I think that's an interesting juxtaposition, isn't it? Because on the one hand, one could feel that that is safer and healthier because the the objective nature of my performance isn't necessarily impinging on my perception of the performance, and so subsequently that might not ameliorate my confidence or motivation or something like that. Whereas in contrast, is that not just delusion? Am I not just deluding my am I not is engaging in self-compassion, and we're just speculating here, this is just an interesting speculation, engaging in self-compassion could lead us down this path of not actually paying attention to the objective nature of performance, but possibly, and so subsequently I miss cues and clues from that performance that may negatively impact my learning or my future performances, possibly.
And Dan, I think that's a critique that I've come against multiple times, or a question rather, is because you're self compassionate, are you just simply not, you know, giving yourself the hard look in the mirror that you should be doing as an athlete? And like you said, you're deluding yourself and you're not being grounded in reality. And for that, what we do know is that measurements of perceived performance tend to be quite on the nose with measurements of objective performance. So that's not something we're too worried about, is like if these measurements of perceived performance are just like way off track and everyone's giving themselves a 10 out of 10 all the time. We do find that when an expert judge rates someone, let's say an athlete a 6, that the athlete themselves tends to rate themselves around there as well too. And two, theoretically, if we are being more self compassionate, then we should also be grounding ourselves in reality more than someone that is not being self compassionate. Again, perhaps that non self compassionate person is being quite harshly self critical. And they are, when they maybe gave an 8 out of 10 performance, they are ranking themselves as a 2 out of 10. And they're just self-flagellating, being quite cruel and harsh to themselves. But as well, too, that non-self-compassionate athlete could also have that element of delusion in that they're not accepting or even noticing that there is an issue at play as well too. So they might have, again, given an 8 out of 10 performance objectively, but are ranking themselves as a 10 out of 10. Theoretically, that self-compassionate athlete with that element of mindfulness should be able to perceive their environment, to perceive their emotions and their thoughts, and ideally their performance too. Research is yet to come out on this one. Again, I'm just postulating. They should be able to see what had happened exactly for what it is, and therefore be able to evaluate themselves very realistically.
As you're speaking there, it makes me think of self-compassion being part of flexible thinking, flexible attention, that the capacity to, in a very simplistic way here, flex up and down a continuum of looking at my performance from a harsher perspective, and then maybe looking at my performance from a rose-tinted perspective. Just flexing up and down in order to creating that narrative around that flex in order to manage how I feel about it. It's just getting me thinking of it in that perspective. It fits in. It's a self-compassion is a tool that can fit in reflective practice, I suppose. That amongst other ways of thinking that can benefit my review process. No question, just a ramble.
Dan, I think you're getting yourself an invite to our weekly lab group meetings, because this link between self-compassion and performance has been a huge topic. Because at the end of the day, if we can tell coaches and athletes that self-compassion is linked to performance, I think that's a fairly quick way in compared to some of the other ways. And I really believe that there is some evidence coming up that it might not help you in a specific moment being more self-compassionate or not, but probably what it's going to do is going to benefit you over the long term because you are going to respond from things quicker. You'll be more consistently at the peak of your performance each day because you won't have these major setbacks that harsh self-criticism sometimes offers us. I think what one message that when I've worked with athletes and coaches, it's like, what, if you have an athlete or you are an athlete that is unafraid to fail because you have the personal resources to deal with that failure if you fail, you can go out there and try anything. If you're an athlete that if you fail, you're in a deep, dark place, sometimes you can't put yourself in those positions. Maybe you can't go to the Olympics. Maybe you can't go to a world championship because if you don't succeed, you're going to be in a dark place for a long time. But if you can go there and you have all the personal resources and skills to deal with anything that happens, man, go out there and just go for it. And at the end of the day, I think as coaches, as mental performance trainers, as athletes, I think that's what we want. We want this ability to just go for things and know that no matter what happens, I'm going to be okay. And that I have the skills to come back the next day, keep training, keep pushing for my goals. And I think that's what self-compassion helps offer us. It's this keeps us out of these dark, long holes when we don't perform the way we hope we can. And um, yeah, and I think so. It's responding to the poor performances where I think self-compassion is going to really find its niche in performance.
We could have some fun here doing a deeper dive, and I love everything you said there because I find that a lot of my consultancy practice revolves around if we work in environment sport, whereby in many respects participants and certainly those at the competitive level, the elite competitive level, the developing elite competitive level, are socialized. They live in a world, they're socialized into being hard on themselves, being tough on themselves around outcomes and performance outcomes, because I think there's a subtle hand with performance. Performance is split into two for me: performance outcomes, as in KPIs, key performance indicators, and a performance process. Listening to what you said there, Ken, it makes me think of some of the narratives I work on with players around, well, look, I'd like to have great outcomes, but I can't completely control those outcomes. So there's a rational perspective to this here. But performance, I think, is really interesting and quite complex in as much as, again, competitors tend to be really tough on themselves, not compassionate at all around, if we take goalkeepers, for instance, I've got to get, my footwork right every time. I've got to get my handling spot on. You've got to make all of my saves. I've got to make sure I cleanly catch crossing balls and so on and so forth. And some of those are that we can influence, but they're not always completely within our control because we're human beings, and as being a human being with almost 400 bones in my body, those kind of performance indicators are tough to get absolutely perfect, but we're so tough on ourselves there. So in many respects, in my own practice, I'm trying to help competitors, players, be kinder on themselves, so more compassionate on themselves around performance outcomes. I'm not going to catch everything. I'm not going to complete all my passes. I'm not going to get everything right here. And that's okay. But maybe if I'm going to direct my toughness anywhere, I'm going to be tougher on my performance process. I'm a bit tougher on myself in terms of my body language or my self-talk or things that are under control, like my scanning behavior or, my vocals or something like that. So I'm doing a slightly deeper dive there, but it makes me think of where, in my own practice, self-compassion really fits in. It really is around the outcome and the performance outcome side of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, Dan. And yeah, I think that's where Kristen Neff's ideas of fierce self-compassion really come in. Is that
Okay.
an athlete that is self-compassionate is going to take the steps to improve those process elements, the things that they can control. But if they've worked to 10 years and don't get the outcome that they wanted, they're not going to, or they're going to ask themselves what they need in that moment. and do everything they can to support themselves. And that's what, at its essence, what self-compassion is. Right now I failed at the Olympics. I'm suffering, I'm hurting. What do I need right now? And that's going to have some tender caring aspects, and it's going to have some motivational get back to the gym elements, right?
And I love you've almost taken the helicopter viewpoint there. I mean, I was quite close in the weeds of performance, and the helicopter viewpoint is the reality is dealing with failure, isn't it? Especially at the elite end of sport, is I've gone to the Olympics, I failed. Well, it's all very well talking about being, not being tough on yourself with, on performance then, but the reality is you've worked so hard over the years. That's when it's so difficult, isn't it? So challenging, Danielle, to be tolerant on yourself or to be self-compassionate with yourself when you've maybe experienced what could be perceived as extreme failure, if you like.
Yeah, I agree. And I think a key here, even though we had kind of those mixed results with how self-compassion is related to objective or subjective performance, what we did find, and I believe it was unanimous, was that self-compassion acted as a buffer to setbacks. So just like Kent was saying there, athletes, again, somewhat, I guess, unanimously did voice that as self-compassion could act as somewhat that protective blanket against those moments where times are really, really tough. And a really neat study out of this review here was done with, I believe, football athletes in the United States. And they were taking subjective performance scores every single day after a practice. And they found that the athletes that had higher levels of self-compassion, that were more self-compassionate, on the day after they rated themselves really as having a really poor practice, they were more likely to have a huge boost in their performance in a practice the next day versus their lower self-compassionate peers who tended to have longer strings of poor performance in practices. So I think there's that really key piece there that we've been speaking to, where self-compassion, at the very least, can help pull athletes out of that deep pit of those negative emotions, those negative thoughts, and can help them rebound quicker and faster, which I think at the very least kind of leads into that great relationship that self-compassion has with athlete well-being, and I think helps with that long-term nature of sport participation too. If you're able to pull yourself out of that setback and get back to enjoying what you're doing, then more than likely you're going to be a happier and more satisfied athlete too.
Well, you've mentioned that word well-being, which is a very important word to us in sports psychology. And you've spoken to the performance piece, the relationship between self-compassion and performance. I mean, do feel free to unpack any more that you feel might be there, Danielle, for us around that performance relationship with self-compassion. But maybe, it feels like you've already moved on a little bit to the well-being piece. So talk us through some of your findings on the relationship between self-compassion and well-being.
Mm-hmm. With well-being, there tends to be two kind of silos with that realm of research. There's the hedonic well-being, which is more so happiness, our mood on a day-to-day basis, how we feel in the moment. Am I happy or am I sad? Versus eudaimonic, quite a mouthful, well-being, which is more so, am I reaching my personal potential? Am I self-actualizing as an athlete, as a coach, as a human being? And what we found was that, again, self-compassion was positively related. It led to increases in both of those types of well-being. So that was, again, reassuring for Kent and I, again, with that kind of like zoomed out long-term approach to an athlete's career. I think it's equally of importance, like kind of Kent said there, if we can prove that self-compassion is positively linked to performance, like you got a ticket to ride, you are stamped in. But I think it's also of equal importance to try and have well athletes. And so that's what we found, was that self-compassion was positively linked to both of those types of well-being.
I get the mood piece. I get that. That to me is okay. You have me at hello there. the relationship between self-compassion and self-actualizing feels more subtle to me. Can you explain that a little bit more?
I think that link there is, again, very much situated. Kent, please follow up on me if I'm talking nonsense here. I think that link is situated with self-compassion's kind of those three components, that self-kindness, that mindfulness, that common humanity, in that if I'm being kind to myself, if I'm being aware of the environment around me, if I know that suffering is something that happens to the collective rather than just me myself, and I'm able to take that and kind of rebound from the setbacks in my day-to-day and take action in order to keep pursuing my goals, then eventually, if I'm continuously pursuing those goals and I'm able to self-regulate using tools such as self-compassion to do that, then I get closer and closer to that personal best, to that place I want to be, to making those goals into a reality. So that's my take on things. Once again, we still need a little bit more of that longitudinal research in order to back that up.
Fantastic. That makes complete sense to me. I mean, I don't know if you had anything to add there, Kent, at all.
Yeah, no, I think one of our colleagues is Dr. Leah Ferguson. He's a faculty member with me and does some wonderful self-compassion work and is doing a lot of the work with her graduate students linking to performance. Her and I often joke that although we do similar work, I'm really interested in getting people out of the hole. And once they're not suffering anymore, I'm like, oh, thank goodness. And then once they're out of that hole, she takes them on to this phase of enlightenment in their lives. So my thinking has sort of been really influenced by her, and she's done some work looking at those relationships between self-compassion and psychological flourishing. And I think, within that framework, I think you're setting yourself up for just a good psychological place. If you consider this a worldview where I'm treating myself with kindness and understanding, and that's the worldview that I bring, I'm more likely going to have positive social relationships. I'm more likely going to be able to work towards mastery of goals, because when I face setbacks, they won't, they're not going to break me. So I leave the sport. They're going to allow me to sort of have more of a purpose, because I can sustain my motivation in the pursuit of certain goals rather than abandoning them. So it's sort of this web that of these well-being indicators that I think it's like just a good personal worldview or resource that you have that allows you to move through life maybe more effectively and easier, and therefore we just tend to be closer to who we want and can be. But Leah Ferguson would be an awesome guest to have someday. She could talk about all this stuff forever.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny you should say that, because speaking with Dr. Courtney Walton, who's from Oregon University, who's been on the show to talk about their brilliant work around well-being and mental health and mental illness, suggested that Leah should come onto the show. And it's interesting that the potential relationship between self-compassion and psychological flourishing. I mean, we've spoken about psychological flourishing on the Sports Sex show with one of the best in the business, Dr. Dan Brown, who's done some brilliant work in this country there. So I'm fascinated by that relationship, and I'll definitely seek to get Leah on. So that would be fantastic. But look, this has just been a wonderful conversation. I just think it's a really fascinating area. I think it's, from a personal perspective, getting the opportunity to work with, being honoured to work with elite athletes. I know it's an area that is of interest to them, because that journey is so challenging for them, isn't it? And so any tools in their toolbox that helps them to manage their mood, to feel like they're self-actualizing, getting the most from what they've got, and obviously anything that can also play with their performance as well. Hey, that's got to be a win-win-win, right? Look, I mean, to finish things here, what next? Danielle, what next for you? Where's this going? What's the immediate future looking like in this and other things for yourself?
Yeah, I think for this, even though we spoke to it a lot and we're both very excited about it, I think a really big key piece is to investigate how athletes perceive fear self-compassion in sport. Like I said, that book from Dr. Kristen Neff came out about a year and a half ago. It's still new, still a little bit warm off of the presses, although the heat is getting down to room temperature. But no research has been done yet on investigating, again, how athletes might use fierce self-compassion, when they might use tender versus fierce, whether it is a decent strategy for improving performance and well-being. So I think that's a really interesting direction that particularly the domain of sport research can go into, and something that our lab was looking at investigating as well.
Brilliant. And Kent, yourself, assuming you're going to be involved in that, but what else for you?
Yeah, we just finished sort of one of our major research grants focused on men, masculinity, and self-compassion. And, I still think there's a lot there to look at masculinity, femininity, not just with men, but those concepts across, across different people, because one thing we found with men athletes is that, there's the level of first convincing somebody to try self-compassion. That's a different way of doing it. But then there's the other level. Can I actually show my team that I'm doing it and acting this way? And it links back to what you'd said before about, the world of sport has this, we need to be harsh on ourselves. And sometimes if you don't show that to the world, you get critique for it. So, we're finding that men certainly find themselves in that place where, first of all, will they try it? And then if they are willing to try it, can they actually show it in those contexts in which they live out their sporting lives without paying a social consequence for it? So I find that absolutely fascinating. And then I think, really, I think we're getting to the point where finding good, strong interventions. There's some really good ones that are starting out there, but really finding ways to intervene in the most effective and best ways with different groups. And again, it goes. You're right on target to the whole podcast here, because you even started with issues around language and the concept and how do we connect with different groups. What exercises are going to work for people that want to, for example, see a self-compassionate worldview for themselves moving forward versus those that just want a skill in the moment to help themselves, and what does that look like for different groups? So I think continued focus on masculinity, femininity, and then effective intervention across diverse groups would probably be two potential intriguing avenues that I'd be interested in.
Brilliant. Fantastic. I can't thank you enough, both of you, for coming onto the show. It's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. How can people find you if you want to be found, follow you if you'd like to be followed, and check out your work, particularly this scoping review? Danielle, if we come to you first.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at DL Cormier without the R. I really have to rethink that handle. It's very difficult to say out loud. But I'm on Twitter. I try to share and do as much knowledge translation of what we're putting out as much as possible on there. So people can, go ahead and find me there. And the scoping review was published in the International Review of Sport and Exercise Psychology. So folks will be able to click around there on the most recent articles for now. And that's where they can find this work.
Fantastic. And Kent, are you a man on Twitter?
I am not so much. I am not.
You're not. You're not. Okay.
It's one of my weaknesses in life is my social outreach of my.
Is that a weakness or is that a sensible decision?
Yeah, I haven't decided yet. At times both. But I think going to our selfkinpassion.com website, you can easily connect with Leah and I or get our contact information there, or kent.kowalski@usask.ca. I'm at the University of Saskatchewan in the College of Kinesiology. People can feel free to reach out. One thing I've enjoyed since the moment I was introduced to self-compassion is conversation about self-compassion. It's just one of those topics that absolutely intrigues me. I'm always happy to talk about it in a very open way because I do have very applied goals. I want it to be beneficial for people. So happy to chat.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you so much, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that episode, and I hope you did too. Please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. I'd be delighted to hear any suggestions that you have. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.